There's a cargo ship called the Mariana sitting overturned on the floor of the Pacific Ocean, roughly 100 nautical miles northeast of Saipan. It is a 145-foot dry cargo vessel, American registered, and it went down during the storm. 6 crew members were on board when it lost engine power and capsized. Rescuers from the United States, Japan, and New Zealand have now covered more than 99,000 square nautical miles of open ocean searching for them. They found one body inside the hull. 5 people are still missing. Somewhere in that search area, there may be an orange 12-person life raft. Coast Guard air crews are still looking. That story, 6 crew members, 1 body recovered, 5 still gone, has received almost no coverage in mainland American media. It has been subsumed by the larger story of 50,000 American citizens on islands that are still, more than a week after the typhoon passed, without power and without running water. And that story has itself been partially subsumed by the announcement of the disaster declaration, the press releases about generators being delivered to hospitals, and the photographs of FEMA officials standing in front of debris piles explaining what comes next. What comes next is what always comes next for these islands. And that is the detail that makes this story something different from a breaking news event. It makes it a pattern. And patterns, unlike storms, do not end when the all clear is declared. Begin with what Sinlaku actually was, because the atmospheric facts of this storm are not routine. Super Typhoon Sinlaku formed southeast of the Commonwealth of the Northern Mariana Islands and rapidly grew to a Category 5 system. Grist. Before it reached the CNMI, it had peaked at sustained winds of 185 miles per hour, making it the strongest tropical cyclone on Earth in 2026. The National Weather Service said it was the strongest tropical cyclone on Earth this year when it made landfall with sustained winds of up to 150 miles per hour. Idaho News. Those numbers are significant, but they are not the number that determined how much damage Sinlaku inflicted on Saipan and Tinian. The number that determined that was 3, as in 3 miles per hour. That is the speed at which Sinlaku was moving as it passed directly over both islands. A typhoon at normal forward speed crosses a populated island in hours. The worst of it is over. People emerge. They begin to assess. Sinlaku's slow movement, crawling at roughly 3 miles per hour as it passed over Saipan and Tinian, meant residents endured an extended period within the eye wall. Hours of the most intense conditions a tropical cyclone can produce. Post-Guam. The warning coordination meteorologist at National Weather Service Guam said that experience was unprecedented for these islands. Residents did not endure a typhoon. They endured a typhoon that refused to leave. Saipan had tropical storm force conditions for over 3 days and typhoon force conditions for over 24 hours. Post-Guam. The all-clear was not declared until Friday, April 18th. Sinlaku made landfall on Tuesday night, April 14th. That is more than 50 hours of destructive winds, flooding, and storm surge across a chain of islands with a combined population of roughly 50,000 people, all of them American citizens, most of them living in structures that were not built to withstand what they were asked to withstand. The National Weather Service meteorologist who monitored the storm said, "Most structures that were not reinforced concrete don't exist anymore, so a lot of things were significantly impacted. It's going to be a long road to recovery." St. Thomas source. That phrase, most structures that were not reinforced concrete, describes the majority of residential housing on both Saipan and Tinian, corrugated tin roofing over timber framing. It is the dominant construction material for working class and lower income housing across the Pacific. It is what generations of families on these islands have lived under, and in a sustained 150 mile per hour wind event that lasted more than a day, it does not hold. The chief of staff to the Tinian mayor wrote out the storm with municipal officials and emerged with a 4-word assessment of what remained. Anything that was tinned is destroyed. The Commonwealth Utilities Corporation has 15,624 customers on Saipan, including 11,969 residential homes. Pack times. 1 week after the storm passed, most of those homes still had no power. Crews working to restore power found 604 poles down on secondary lines alone. NMI News Service primary feeder assessments were complete. The scale of the secondary line damage is why the restoration timeline is measured not in days, but in weeks, and potentially longer. The storm heavily damaged Saipan's sole public safety communications tower, the backbone for police, fire, emergency teams, and power restoration crews. The tower site was inaccessible due to debris, further complicating restoration efforts. FEMA. This is the detail that does not appear in the press releases about generators and bottled water shipments. The single most important piece of infrastructure for coordinating any disaster response on the island, the tower that lets first responders talk to each other, that connects police dispatch to patrol units, that links hospitals to ambulances, was itself knocked out. Before FEMA could effectively coordinate the recovery, they had to first build a temporary communication system to replace the permanent one that no longer worked. That is not a minor logistical obstacle. That is a situation where the storm destroyed the island's ability to recover from the storm before the recovery could even begin. Water and power could be unavailable for weeks. American Red Cross. That assessment came from the Red Cross, which has responded to every major typhoon on these islands for years and has no institutional incentive to overstate the damage. Bottled water shipments were routed to Saipan, Tinian, and Rota. FEMA had pre-positioned roughly 1 million liters of water and 723,000 meals at a distribution center in Guam before the storm made landfall. The agency said it also had 1,500 cots, 3,600 blankets, 4,400 tarps, and 78 generators ready, with 42 additional generators already on their way to Saipan. Grist that pre-positioning was real and it helped. But 78 generators for a residential population of 50,000 people on islands where the power grid is down across thousands of homes is a triage measure. It keeps hospitals running and wells pumping. It does not give a family in Cagman or Chelan Kanoa their lights back. The CNMI's congressional delegate, Kimberlyn King-Hines, described the situation from Washington before the declaration was signed. It's been a long week. It feels like a month. Folks have been lining up at the gas. People have been waiting for power. People have been waiting for water. People are just exhausted from having to endure days and days being battered by those incredibly strong winds. RNZ, those words were spoken by an elected representative in Washington on behalf of American citizens. The people she was describing were not in a foreign disaster zone waiting for international humanitarian aid. They were in a U.S. territory with U.S. passports on islands that have paid taxes, served in the U.S. military, and flown the American flag for decades. They were lining up at gas stations and waiting for water in the dark, a week after a storm that the federal government had known was coming for days before it arrived. Now here is what this storm exposed that the storm itself did not create. Super Typhoon. U2 followed a nearly identical track 8 years ago, destroying thousands of homes and forcing children to go to school in tents. Grist U2 made landfall with maximum sustained winds of 180 miles per hour. It was, at the time, the strongest tropical cyclone ever to make landfall on American soil. The recovery from U2 was years long. Federal audits later documented delays in the release of FEMA individual assistance funds, disputes over damage assessments, and gaps in the rebuilding of critical infrastructure. When Sinlaku arrived in April 2026, infrastructure resilience on Tinian was, in the documented assessment of disaster observers, already under strain from that previous storm. The Tinian Health Center had sustained extensive damage in U2. Recovery there was expected to be complex going into Sinlaku because the baseline was already compromised. This is the loop that these islands have been trapped in for decades. A major typhoon strikes. The federal response mobilizes. The declaration is signed. The generators arrive. The headlines move on. The recovery drags for years. The infrastructure never fully returns to a standard that could withstand the next major storm. And then the next major storm arrives, and the cycle begins again, each time from a slightly weaker baseline than the time before. FEMA Region 9. Administrator Robert Fenton acknowledged that hardened infrastructure installed after past disasters, such as concrete poles and FEMA-built housing, held up well during Sinlaku. Installed after past disasters, such as concrete poles and FEMA-built housing, held up well during Sinlaku. Isla Public. That is significant. The concrete poles did not fall. The FEMA-built housing held. The problem is the proportion of the housing stock and infrastructure that was hardened after previous storms versus the proportion that was not. When the majority of residential roofing on an island is still corrugated tin, when a sole public safety communications tower has no backup, when the power grid's secondary lines can lose 600 poles in a single storm, the hardened elements are islands of resilience inside a larger system that remains profoundly fragile. Safety communications tower has no backup. When the power grid's secondary lines can lose 600 poles in a single storm, the hardened elements are islands of resilience inside a larger system that remains profoundly fragile. The U.S. American forces intend to make more use of the CNMI as a training and logistics location and are rehabilitating old World War II airfields on Tinian as part of the Air Force's Agile Combat Employment Scheme for a potential conflict in the region. And are rehabilitating old World War II airfields on Tinian as part of the Air Force's Agile Combat Employment Scheme for a potential conflict in the region. Asia Times. The strategic logic is straightforward. The Western Pacific is the theater that American military planners consider most likely to require sustained U.S. force projection in the coming decade. The CNMI sits at the geographic center of that theater. Tinian's airfields, which launched the B-29s that dropped the atomic bombs in 1945, are being rebuilt as dispersal bases for modern Air Force operations under a doctrine designed to survive a peer adversary's first strike. The United States is investing in military infrastructure on these islands because military planners believe those islands matter. The question that has not been answered publicly is why that same logic does not extend to civilian infrastructure. Why the power grid of an island that the Air Force is using as a strategic base can still be knocked out by a Category 4 typhoon. Why the sole public safety communications tower on Saipan has no redundancy. Why 50,000 American citizens who live on strategically critical American soil are still waiting for water a week after a storm that was predicted, tracked, and understood days before it arrived. The cargo vessel Mariana lost its starboard engine on Wednesday night, April 16th, as Sinlaku was passing directly over Saipan. After the crew reported engine failure and requested assistance, the Coast Guard set up a 1-hour communication schedule with the vessel. CBS News. Then the storm swallowed it. Search and rescue flights that were launched to find the ship had to turn back because the typhoon's conditions made flight impossible. By the time the weather allowed a proper search, the Mariana had overturned and drifted. Japan's Coast Guard patrol vessel arrived on scene to assist. The Coast Guard and agencies from Guam, Japan, and New Zealand covered more than 99,000 square nautical miles in the search. PBS. 1 body was recovered from inside the hull. 5 people remain missing. The orange life raft that searchers are looking for holds 12 people. There are 5 people unaccounted for. The mathematics of hope are still technically open. The disaster declaration that President Trump signed on Thursday unlocks FEMA individual assistance across all of Saipan, Tinian, Rota, and the Northern Islands. Assistance can include grants for temporary housing and home repairs, low-cost loans to cover uninsured property losses, and other programs to help individuals and families recover from the effects of the disaster. FEMA. For a family whose tin roof is gone and whose walls are damaged and whose savings were limited before the storm, the pathway through FEMA individual assistance is not simple. It requires registration, documentation of losses, and a verification process that takes time. Time during which that family is living without a roof, without power, and potentially without water, on an island where the administrative infrastructure for filing claims has itself been damaged by the storm. The congresswoman who delivered the declaration described it as a major first step. It is. It is also the beginning of a process that, measured against the U2 recovery, will take years to complete and will leave the islands less prepared for the next storm than anyone who signed the declaration will publicly acknowledge. Governor David Apatang told residents after the storm, "We're good in that, so let's just work together and we'll be okay. We can recover from this." Grist, that is what a governor is supposed to say. It is also what the governor of these islands said after U2. And after Sudalor. The people who live here have heard it before. They know how to survive a typhoon. They have been surviving typhoons their entire lives. What they have not been given through any of the declarations and recoveries and federal programs of the past decade is infrastructure that does not need to be survived. Infrastructure that holds a power grid that does not collapse when the wind gets strong enough. A communications tower that has a backup. Housing stock that does not shred when corrugated tin meets 150-mile-per-hour winds. The typhoon season of the Western Pacific does not end in April. It begins in earnest in June and peaks between August and October. The storm that just destroyed 11,000 homes and knocked out the power and water for 50,000 American citizens was the strongest tropical cyclone on Earth in 2026. It arrived months before the peak of the season it technically belongs to. The reconstruction that needs to happen before the next storm arrives is measured in months of work. The history of recovery on these islands suggests that months of work typically takes years. The generators are running in Saipan's hospitals tonight. The Coast Guard is still searching 99,000 square miles of ocean for 5 people who may be on a life raft. And somewhere on Tinian, in a house where the tin roof used to be, a family that survived. The storm is waiting for someone to tell them when the water comes back on. The declaration was signed today. The real crisis starts now.